So after moving away and getting done with your thesis statement, you've got that all settled and you're thinking about audience, what are you going to do with the information that you find about your research question or the ideas you have about your topic? One thing you can do is sort them into categories. This is particularly helpful as you start to gather information for developing your essay. Some of them are pretty common. You've probably heard of highlighting is one, and putting them into slides, like a slide presentation like this, and you can start to rearrange the slides and see how they work best. If you like note cards, the way I think I did research when I was in school, which is a while ago. But anyway, so yeah, note cards, those work too. Some of us like that kind of thing, still a hard paper copy, and then we can rearrange those too to sort things that match and go together into categories that then can be developed into maybe paragraphs or main points. So whatever you choose, you will definitely have to start organizing your thoughts into particular categories. The next step, as you gather research and you get ready to draft and you're not quite ready to draft, is to start thinking about maybe outlining. Some would say that outlining is required, and if you grew up that way or you were trained that way or you find that a useful way to organize your paper as a whole, do that. I recommend it highly. Some people don't find outlining very helpful. As a matter of fact, some people find outlining so unhelpful that they write the whole paper and then they create the outline if, let's say, an outline assignment is required. So it really just depends on how your brain works, how you organize information, how you make sense of what you've read, and how you want to articulate your argument. It's perfectly fine to outline if that helps you, but it's also perfectly fine to approach organizing your essay in another way. So, for example, a formal outline is kind of what I'm talking about, like point 1, and then your 2 points underneath it, A, B, and then more points underneath that. And you use that as kind of main topic sentences for each paragraph. But other people might really kind of, I wouldn't even call this outline, but informal outlining, where you really just kind of make a list or short list or a bullet point list about things you know you want to talk about in this particular section, things you want to know you want to talk about in another section. So that's a kind of outlining, and that works great for people too, so that they can keep track of the ideas they have without necessarily making it so formal. So consider some of those ideas to help plan your project. If it's been a while since you've done any writing, or academic writing in particular, it's always good to remind ourselves what the academic convention is about the structure of a paper or an essay. So it might sound kind of fundamental to begin with paragraphs, but really a paragraph is a microcosm of the larger essay. So if you can think about the pieces and elements of a paragraph that support your overall argument or thesis, then your paper will come together nicely and solidly. So paragraphs are made of essentially 4 main parts. They don't have to necessarily be in the order that I indicate here, but as long as you have all 4 parts, then generally speaking, your paragraph will function well. Every paragraph has to have a main idea, one purpose, one raison d'etre, and a reason for existence. You have to have a main idea. Typically, in an academic paper, the next thing you need is an example or quote that illustrates that main idea. This might be from your research or your observations or field work, or it could be an example. Most of the time, we stop there as writers. I know when I write, I usually think, well, that's enough. I've said my main idea. Here's my example. I'm done. However, really what's next are the 2 most important pieces. Analysis is the 3rd part of the paragraph. And that explains why your example that you chose illustrates the main idea. So it's not enough to say your main idea and show an example. You also have to explain why that example works. Without the analysis, you really have sort of an example that people could interpret in many different ways. And you want to make sure that your reader or your audience thinks of your example in the same way that you think of that example. Finally, the last part, and perhaps the most key part, is a link to the main idea or thesis that illustrates to your reader why this example and this main idea supports your overall main argument. Without that link, a lot of times your reader will forget why this example is included. So all 4 parts are important to include. So once you've found your research and you've got some nice quotes you want to include in your paragraphs to support your point, you want to think about how best to integrate those quotes. And there's a few things to keep in mind when you're doing that. One thing is, don't start or finish a paragraph with a quote. And that really comes down to letting your ideas be sort of pushed forward by a quote rather than your own words. So you always want to start a paragraph with your words, lead into why the quote is important, say the quote, and then explain why you chose that particular piece of evidence to support your point. So you always want a little intro, you want to use the example, and then you want to use some analysis to help you explain it. So that really fits in with our meal plan approach if you think about it, because you have your main idea, this could be your words, here's your example or quote, that's the quote from the text, and then the analysis part is you explaining why that quote works or why it's important to know about to that particular paragraph, why it's essential to that paragraph. So always use a quote in the middle of your paragraph, because if it starts at the beginning, you're in the middle, and the reader won't know why you've chosen that quote then. It'll sort of come out of the blue. If you have it at the end, then you're just sort of leaving off that last piece of a paragraph's components by sort of expecting that the quote will be enough to explain your point, like it'll be obvious, but of course it isn't obvious. We have to see your words in order to understand what it is that you mean. So again, you want to lead into your quote with words that help the reader know what to expect, including any necessary context that helps explain why you chose that particular quote. After the quote, like I said, you're going to want to explain why the quote works. And a lot of times what I do is use a phrase, and it may sound a little formulaic at first, but I think it's really helpful as you get into the habit of explaining what your quotes mean. So what I'll say is, according to John Smith, and then you lead into your quote, and then right after your quote, the next thing I usually say is, so in other words, what Smith is saying is blank, blank, blank. And that is important because that supports my main idea in these ways. So you can be pretty formulaic at first as you get used to integrating quotes in a sort of smooth and productive way. If you do quote, always use an in-text citation. In APA style, it's last name, comma, year, comma, and then the page number if you're including a direct quote. APA has some flexibility on how you cite paraphrases, but if it's a direct quote, you have to include the page number. Also, you always have to include the full citation on the references page. And you can't have an in-text citation without a corresponding reference on the reference page. So those are also listed by last name first, Jones, comma, A. We don't spell out the whole first name, we just use the first initial. The year it was published, and then the title in italics, and then the publication information. We discussed the conventions of including paragraphs and incorporating quotes and research into those paragraphs in order to support an argument in academic writing. This is really an example of what that integration of a quote looks like if you would rather see it visually rather than hear about it. So even though I've talked about it already, this is a visualization and a coding in different colors of how that paragraph works. So it might be easier to see depending on the way you process information. So paraphrasing is a little bit different than integrating direct quotes. And you've probably paraphrased things before when you've written papers. And sometimes paraphrasing can be, I think, particularly tricky because with direct quotes, it's really clear. These aren't my words. You put your quotation marks, you put your citation, and you're set. With paraphrasing, when you're trying to reword something into your own words and not use a direct quote, maybe it's better to summarize for some reason. We sort of fall into the trap of being unable to rethink how to say it. So we end up just changing one word or two words, and yet that doesn't really change the sort of overall feel or integrity of the quote, and then we've accidentally plagiarized and we didn't mean to. So you want to be careful to not just change words, but sort of read the quote, put it aside, and then write out what you think it means in your own words without looking at the language and the syntax of the way the other writer used language to make their idea clear. So you want to put it into your own words by reading it, putting the original aside, and then just try pretending you're explaining it to a friend or a relative, or you're writing an email, a completely different audience, because that can really help you avoid the sort of perils and pitfalls of paraphrasing poorly. And APA rules are about citing page numbers with paraphrased material are kind of left up to either the instructor or the writer, depending on what situation you're in. So APA doesn't require in the manual that paraphrased material be cited with a page number. It does need to be cited, so you still have to say the author and the year. But since it's not a direct quote, there may or may not be a corresponding page number where that material comes from. Like you might have gotten it in a whole chapter or something like that. So APA gives you a little flexibility there. However, your teacher might think something quite different, and so it's always best to ask the instructor's preference for paraphrasing material. Do you want the page number included? Because if they have a preference and they think for some reason that there should have been a page number included and you didn't include it,
then that could be problematic, and you don't want to have those kinds of issues for no reason. The other thing is, if you want to be better safe than sorry, it's never wrong to include the page number. So even though APA gives you the flexibility of choosing, if you know where it comes from, you can include the page number and you're safe either way. That's probably the best way to go if you happen to have that information, which you probably do. So we want to think about, too, the reason that we have to do this and the reason we have to be careful is if we think about writing as more of an art than a skill, then we have to acknowledge the fact that we have to change it completely. Otherwise, we're sort of adopting someone else's art form. So that means that if we think about songs, you've probably read over the years about lawsuits about how some songs are too similar. There's a court case that says, hey, you've got the exact same sort of refrain here, or the language is so similar that one could think these two songs are the same. Those are actually kind of, in a way, examples of plagiarism because the writer, the new writer, let's say, hasn't changed the song enough for it to become new original work. So we understand that there's a lot of common ideas and common thinking in the world, and we recognize that we're always sort of remixing and adopting ideas and language, and there's a lot of fluidity sometimes in that way. But at the same time, everybody says things a little bit differently, and because we think of that, again, like writing and music or art as more of a craft or an art rather than a skill, we have to recognize that there's a certain amount of authorship and creation attached to those experiences, which is why we want to cite in general.